Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I'm continuing with my discussion regarding the IQ of President Barack Obama. It's Black History Month, so I'm focusing on President Barack Obama, but I'm going to be comparing him with other American presidents. So I came across this putative study that had President Obama's uh, histoiometric, IQ based on histoiometrics. He didn't take an IQ test, not that I'm aware of. And so they estimated his IQ. They did a guesstimation. So there are these psychohistorians, right? They analyze, the output of a president, his life, his biography, his examination scores, his education, and their accomplishments, and they collate and they compare with other uh, historical figures with their known IQs, and they try and they use it's a putative IQ score. It's not really factual, but it's a guesstimation. They estimate what it is, and I've done videos discussing a research study that I read, in which the IQs of American presidents from George Washington all the way down to the our 42nd president, sorry, 43rd, up to 43rd president, up to George W. Bush, right? But I'd never seen any research study that had the IQ of President Barack Obama or President Joe Biden or President Donald Trump. Now, I came across this website that ostensibly pulled it called IQ results for all presidents up to President Donald Trump from various work, various analysis from psychohistorians. So a historian I've explained, those are historians or psychologists, and they go and research, the backgrounds, and they look at the underlying psychology, based on their own training, and what may have been the motivation of a president, and they can also do these guesstimations of IQ scores as well. So modern psychologists and psychiatrists, that they're very interested in IQ scores. By the way, IQ scores they're not entirely accurate. They're based on Western standards. They are biased, right? And they're not entirely accurate. They can be very misleading. So they're supposed to be used with caution, and there've been divergent measures, right? More modern measures that are variables of the traditional IQ scores, which are again based on Western measures. For instance, they're based on affinity with the English language, affinity with understanding Western civilization, Western culture. Language plays a huge part of these measurements, and there's this bias for Westernization. And there's also the bias for two-dimensional text, right? The written, because, they also do examinations, testing, the ability to read, or today with modern times, maybe the focus on ability to read on a screen from a computer, right? So there are cultures that don't have these standards, or they don't have these uh, similar experiences, but they're remarkably brilliant. I know, for instance, my culture, Yoruba people, they're an oral culture, and they have a phenomenal. If they were to test IQ for just memory and things like that and analysis, I mean, they'd be off the charts. They're remarkable. They have exceptional memory, because they are able to keep huge records in their store, huge records in their mind, and the analysis, all the figures of speech, all the extensive records, right? And that's something that Western civilization is not able to do so well, because we've gotten used to recording things on print, in records, on computer, in databases, and we could just retrieve them without you exercising our memory. So cultural context, right? The IQs are biased towards culture, especially Western culture, right? And they tend to disfavor non-Western culture. So again, they are to be taken with a grain of salt, right? They're not absolute measurements, right? They're heavily skewed, heavily biased, heavily jaundiced. That being said, um, Barack Obama in this measurement was pegged to have had the second highest IQ, right? Second highest IQ of American presidents. Of course, consistently ranked as having the highest, and I don't think anybody would dispute that, is John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, in this measurement, he's ranked as having about 168.2, right? Which, is scaled differently, by the way. And so the relative measures are still the same. That's the measurements relative to the president. They're still ranked the same, right? But they may use different scales, right? So, like in this scale, it was 168.2 for John Quincy Adams. He still had the highest IQ. In the study, a research study that I read, right, that had all the presidential IQs and analysis from George Washington up to number 43, President George W. Bush. That scale was different, and in that scale, President John Quincy Adams' IQ was 175, again the highest, and the second next IQ to him in that was 160, and it was scored by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, right? So with this having a slightly different scale, Barack Obama coming second on this um, measurement and scale that I saw. Barack Obama had 155 and Thomas Jefferson about 153, right? So if I were to try and scale it back to that research study, Barack Obama would still be second, and roughly maybe his scale would be at around 166 or 163, right? 163, still second, and after him would be Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. In the old scale I saw, after that was John F. Kennedy at about 159 or just over 159. Then Bill Clinton, at about 158. After that was after Bill Clinton was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was about 156. And all these, so all the people that are deemed to be high are still similarly high. Interestingly, though, this study had the IQ of President Donald Trump, and it was 145. It was rather high. And that 145, he was said to be higher than John Adams. It was higher than James Madison. In this study, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson weren't equalized like in the research that I'd read. That was an extensive research, by scientists. The one that I think it was about 25 or 30 or 40 pages that are long. But in this, it was just a ranking. I couldn't see how the methodology they used. I just saw the rankings, and just brief, analysis, description. It used just more of a narrative, right? So President Trump is supposed to be higher than James Madison, a variety of people, so I'm going to do a different video talking about, maybe President Trump, but this I'm going to focus on President Barack Obama. And, um, I don't wholly completely agree because we've had many very intelligent, highly intelligent presidents, right? And uh, prior to this era, traditionally found the earliest presidents are normally called the founding presidents. They've had the highest IQs, right? Um, of all our presidents, right? And it makes sense because back then they didn't have the distraction of telecommunications, television, and social media. They didn't have any of those distractions, right? And of course, some people had the advantage or I don't know if you could call it advantage, the advantage of time, being able to use their time because they were free from having to labor because they owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned 600 slaves, right? Thomas Jefferson was a polymath. You'd expect that Thomas Jefferson, they'd normally rank Thomas Jefferson higher because he was a polymath, he was a horticulturist, right? He did science as well. And that's another thing that I noticed about our past presidents, right? It tends the IQ psychohistorians that do the high IQ scores using historiometrics, they tend to overfavor presidents with a humanities background. Of course, the majority of our presidents had a humanities background. They were lawyers. Most lawyers, have a humanities background. We had very few presidents who were scientists, like James Garfield. James Garfield is scores as having, one of the highest IQs of our presidents, and reasonably so. He was a lawyer. He didn't come from privilege. He had actually been a pastor. He's our only president who's been a pastor, by the way. And he was a mathematician. He actually is our only, we have a president who created a proof. He created a proof as a supplement to the Pythagorean theorem, right? Everybody knows the Pythagorean theorem, right? Anybody that did math, right? So James Garfield was very smart, but surprisingly, I think he. And so many of our presidents were very smart. Teddy Roosevelt was very smart. Yes, these psychohistorians clearly say he clearly suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder because they didn't have a diagnosis for bipolar disorder then. Just like Lincoln had some kind of manic depression. Everybody's bipolar disorder as well. People understand that. Same as John Adams. John Adams, I read his diary. He actually described he kept a diary and he described his symptoms, when he was ill, how he was hallucinating and things like that, and he'd go into these these moods, depression, and so yes, he did. Today, if a psychiatrist read the diary of John Adams and John Quincy, his son John Quincy Adams, they'd say, well, these people had bipolar disorder, they were manic depressive, they had a mental illness, and which was clear in the family because one of his sons, died by suicide. Several in their family, people died by suicide. Died from some form of alcoholism, went into depression, in their family, in the Adams family. So, yeah. So, so what psychohistorians do is, they study the lives of, the presidents, and they compare them. They try and also compare them to the lives of people who live today, and they use their analytical tools that they have available now that they didn't have back then. So many of our presidents, like I was saying, were very intelligent. Of course, there's Woodrow Wilson, who remains the most educated president we've ever had. He's the only one who has a PhD. He had a law degree. He was a professor at Princeton. He was president of Princeton, and so. But again, he was a historian. He was into the humanities. Again, we've hardly had presidents who were scientists. Now, Herbert Hoover, who was an engineer, he studied engineering at, geology that he actually studied, but he worked as an engineer. Of course, engineering as a field in university is a new field, right? It's sort of novel. He is not ranked so high, right? Maybe in the 130s. Now, to be clear, 130 is actually considered, it could be near genius level, right? Geniuses can have 130. Clearly genius, I think they put them at 145 and over, right? But highly intelligent is over 130, and that can be genius. Geniuses can have about 130 as well. So I think the difference between genius and highly intelligent normally is, a genius does something that's groundbreaking, that it's clear. They produce, they have an output, they use that high intelligence to produce some kind of output that influences, the world, that's very impactful, right? It's not just that, well, so they have this great brain and they're not using it. So the difference between those that they rank as geniuses is that they've used their intellect to influence, to have a large impact on the world, to do something that's groundbreaking, right? Just like Einstein, his theories, or Isaac Newton, right? He created the uh, Newtonian physics. By the way, Newtonian physics, there's something I decided I was going to talk about in terms of Newtonian physics. That's a body at rest tends to be at rest, and a body in motion tends to be in motion. I was going to discuss that in one of my videos because there's something that I was, with respect to that. So unlike Isaac Newton, he gave us laws of gravity and things like that. So he used his genius. It wasn't just sitting in his head. He used it to do things that are impactful, groundbreaking in the world. So many of our presidents were in the 130s. Interesting, in this new study that I read, Joe Biden had the lowest IQ at 115. In the research study that I'd read before, President Grant was given the lowest IQ at 130, so still at a highly intelligent level. But in comparing him to other presidents, I don't know that I agree. And so you can see these histoiometric, these IQs of American presidents based on histoiometrics seems to be like a popularity contest, right? I think it's about presidents that these historians liked, and I think it's also based on surveys or whatever, and not rigorous analysis, right? That are grounded in evidence, right? It's concrete evidence, objective evidence. I think they're highly subjective because when you consider the life of Ulysses Grant, yes, he wasn't a great student, but there are many. The thing about using classroom performance to absolutely determine a person's intelligence, okay, is the inherent flaw, right? So let me give you an example. Imagine two people, X and Y, right? They're given a test, a test to test their intelligence, an exam, and they give them a book to prepare. X reads everything. He studies, right? And he scores 95%. Y doesn't read. He decides not to study. And Y scores 50%. And is it accurate to say, well, that X is more intelligent because of the scores they got, right? Who's to say that if Y had studied, he wouldn't have scored 100%? So if Y had scored, two different scenarios. If Y decides to study and then he scores 100%, but if he doesn't study, he scores 50%, but X still scores 95%, whether he studies or whether Y studies or not. X still scores 95% in both scenarios, right? Is it accurate to say, how can one absolutely say that X is more intelligent than Y? And don't factor in saying that, well, the fact that X knew to study for an exam that was crucial, shows his intelligence. No, that's not how intelligence works, right? It's not, you're trying to measure some kind of ability, right? I don't know if innate ability can easily be measured, but I'm just, showing, the deficiencies of these apparent IQ scores. So, and especially deficiencies in school performance, right? So, Ulysses Grant didn't do very well. He graduated, near the bottom of his class, as he said. He did very well in mathematics, right? He liked reading. He spent his time reading. He read a lot. Again, and he was the son of a wealthy man. You see, the thing is, children of wealthy people are not so motivated to study in school, right? And there are other ways that they engage themselves. But this same Ulysses Grant ended up defeating Robert Lee. Robert Lee had the best score ever achieved at West Point up to their era, and I think he still had the score, the ranking up to the point of at the time of Dwight D. Eisenhower's era. Eisenhower himself he was a mediocre student at West Point. And he's ranked high in the IQ scores. But Eisenhower went on to become a 5-star general, right? Uh, Generals that we know, like the 4-star generals, like Colin Powell was a 4-star general, uh, General Matis, General Mark Millett, all these are all 4-star generals. But um, Eisenhower, who barely made it out of West Point, went on to become a 5-star general and one of only 5 uh, Americans ever to achieve 5-star general, right? So uh, he didn't take, he probably had reasons why he didn't. He wasn't so into his academic work, right? But it's very difficult to use, classroom education to measure people. And it's interesting that Grover, sorry, William Howard Taft, who graduated second in his class at Yale, is normally these historiometrics, measures. They normally don't rank him high, right? They put him around the middle. And even though he's the only president who became Chief Justice, now his decisions, his opinions were questionable, right? His Supreme Court decisions and opinions, they weren't the sharpest, right? He didn't provide the best decision, right? He wasn't normally on the side of history. So I think there's a bit of a popularity contest in these measures of IQ, right? And of course, Teddy Roosevelt, yes, absolutely brilliant. He's normally ranked high because I guess maybe he's favored because he was a progressive president, right? He was a progressive, right? And although his output, you would tend to side with that the output, his performance, um, the variety of his accomplishments, right? The breadth of his accomplishments. He was the first president, I think, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the détente, the peace between Russia and Japan, right? He won a Nobel Peace Prize, but apart from that, he was a prodigious writer. He published, I think, over 30 books, about 40 books in his lifetime. And so he accomplished a lot, and he was dead by 60. He did a lot. He was very productive as president. And it's interesting, his life, even though he was born wealthy, right? And he's said to have inherited an estimated $100 million, so he didn't really have to work. He was born into upper class New York family, but he did something that was unusual. At one time, he moved out to the Dakotas and established a ranch and became a cowboy. He became a sheriff's deputy. So things that upper crust New Yorkers would never consider because he grew up in the Gilded Age. They would never consider, but he went out and became a rancher, right? Became a cowboy. Did these rugged things, and so he had this breadth of experiences, that would make, he didn't sit in his comfort zone, which would make, historians and who rate IQs and intelligence, they place him up there because, of his ability to take risk and challenge and his curiosity, his immense curiosity to just and his versatility. A huge indicator of intelligence is also ability to adapt. One's ability to be versatile, to adapt. To adjust to new things. Right? They just don't sink. They don't implode when their conditions change. When they're exposed to different and novel conditions, they adjust very rapidly. That's a reason why I think I noticed some studies saying generation Gen X, they're highly intelligent because Gen X have had the world change on them very rapidly. It was Gen X that went to writing, totally by hand, writing script by hand. All of a sudden, the digital world came along and they're using computers to do everything, screen, and everything is done on the computer, right? Everything is digital, and they adjusted very rapidly, amongst other drastic changes that occurred that Gen X experienced in the world. Meanwhile, they're saying people like Gen Z and even many millennials, right? They don't even know how to write anymore because they were always used to the digital world. Maybe not millennials, but Gen Z, right? They're always used to the digital world and the world of typing on the computer, and they can hardly write. These are the claims. And with respect to that these presidents that I think many of them were very intelligent from what they did. You could think of James Madison, right? In this measure, it's saying that Donald Trump was more intelligent than James Madison. James Madison had this library of over 4,000 books, and he probably went through them, right? And James Madison, you could see he's called the father of the U.S. Constitution. He drafted the Bill of Rights. James Madison went and studied, past empires, past republics, right, to craft together the Bill of Rights and our Constitution. We're still using our Constitution to this very day, and the Bill of Rights, right? 200 years after. What are the contributions of President Donald Trump that makes these historians think, rank his IQ as being higher than James Madison or John Adams, right? So questionable. Now, in terms of Barack Obama, why did they make it the second highest? I wouldn't say I'm totally in agreement, but I think there's something that I can understand, because Barack Obama, again, is a black man, right? The black man, he belongs to a class or race of people that are, historically and even in contemporary times, have been targeted. They've been excoriated. They've been derided and reviled as the most, they've been targeted, if not for extermination, at least for subjugation in America. That's been the fate of black men in America, right? You can see they're the most incarcerated people today. And the fact that Barack Obama, apart from his prodigious, of course, communication skills, right? But the fact that he was so strategic, right? He's been able to execute this strategic feint that he's been able to use to escape the aversion of his of a class of the majority of the mainstream of people who historically have targeted and subjugated people who look like him, members of a class who look like him. He's been able to escape that and been able to lead them and direct them in the way to go. That's genius. That's genius, right? He did 2 terms, right? He didn't become president by accident. It was great skill. So I guess that's the reason why they put him up there. Let me use an analogy, and I don't mean to be graphic or crude, but I want to end this video now. I'm going to continue in subsequent discussions, right? But to just get the impact, imagine there's an adversary that sends 40 thieves, 40 robbers, 40 dangerous men to go and raid the home of a damsel, a woman living alone, a virgin woman living alone in her home, and 40 brutal men, dangerous, brutal, evil men were sent to rape her. Instead of raping her, however, she's able to convince her captors to go back, right? She's at their mercy. She's their target, she's their victim. She's able to convince her captors not to touch her. And she's all alone, but to go back, right? And rape their master that sent them, right? That's a simple, that's sheer genius right there, right? So that's sort of That's a sort of strategic feint that Barack Obama was able to pull off in his presidency because, you know, and you see, nobody has been able to replicate that, what Barack Obama was able to pull off. So maybe that's the reason why they think, well, that's sheer genius, because, yes, he did great at Harvard Law School. Again, but it was law he did, and he graduated top 10%, magna cum laude. That was the highest um, accolades awarded in his year of graduation, right? There was no summa cum laude. Magna cum laude was the highest, honors awarded at Harvard Law School when he graduated. It's the same thing Chief Justice John Roberts earned. But that is no factor. That should not be a. It's not dispositive to saying someone is a genius or has outstanding intelligence because, again, what's his name? William Howard Taft graduated second in his class at Yale. It wasn't law school, but at Yale, and he became a judge so early. But nobody considers that he has an exceptional genius because of that. Again, he's ranked high. Our presidents in the research study I read, they're typically all over 130. So that's highly intelligent. So that even George W. Bush, that many people think isn't so brilliant because he was a C average student at Harvard. Of course, that was Harvard Business School, and they think, well, he got into Harvard because of legacy, right? Well, his dad didn't go to Harvard. He went to Yale, like his father, for undergrad. But he went to Harvard Business School. People think, well, it was because he was came from a patrician background. I don't know. I'm going to continue. And interestingly, I don't know why, Joe Biden is ranked as having the lowest, in this study, the lowest IQ at 115, which is still above the average for Americans. I think the average American IQ is about between 98 and 105, about 98 and 100. 100, that's the average American IQ. Uh, you know, um, but to say President Joe Biden had the lowest IQ of all American presidents, I don't know. Of course, the fact that he was president at a very old age, when there's diminishing, right? He was no longer at his prime. That could factor into, that could mean a lot. That could be significant, right? It's like you can't test the intelligence of a 4-year old, right? A 4-year old Einstein, right? 4-year-old Einstein is not as it was not as intelligent as uh, a 23-year-old Princeton graduate or MIT graduate. But we know Einstein turned out to become a genius. So time affects your intelligence as well. Intelligence is also a function of time, right? So there's a time you reach your peak, and there's a time you start to diminish, decrease in intelligence because your synapses are just not as sharp anymore. And so, well, I guess they were more focused on performance and output, and the fact that President Biden, was president at a much later age. Well, but that's not so far from President Trump as well. President Trump is approaching 80, he's 79, right? So it's quite similar to the age of President Joe Biden as well. So I don't know. Again, I think these IQ historymetrics and studies and the work of these psychohistorians is based on popularity. It's sort of a popularity contest. I'll continue my discussion. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.